January 17, 1945. Dawn rose weakly over the half-frozen fields west of the Rhine, its pale light catching on coils of barbed wire and the thin crust of snow that clung to the tents of the temporary Allied holding area. The wind carried the smell of diesel and wet canvas, and every few seconds the muffled clatter of distant artillery rolled through the air like a reminder that the world beyond the camp was still burning. A column of German women in long field coats trudged across the ice-glazed ground, escorted by 2 squads of American MPs. Their breath drifted in small white clouds. Some clutched satchels, others nothing at all. None spoke. The war had burned the noise out of them. But when they reached the gate, the silence broke. One of the women, no more than 20, lifted her gaze toward the guard standing under the wooden archway. The Americans loomed over them, taller, broader, wrapped in thick winter uniforms that made them seem almost unreal. A murmur passed through the German ranks, half shock, half disbelief. The guard signaled them forward, and the column stepped into a new world, unaware of how profoundly the hours ahead would expose the fragments of a collapsing Reich. By the opening weeks of 1945, the German war machine resembled an enormous structure still standing but hollowed from within, its beams groaning under the weight of years of attrition. Factories ran on dwindling coal, rail lines fractured under bombardment, and every month thousands more men vanished into the snow-covered ruins of the Eastern Front. To keep the last gears turning, the Reich had drawn deeper into its reserves, calling on women to fill roles once reserved for young soldiers who now existed only as names carved into wooden crosses. In the cities, posters urged women to join the Flakhelferinnen, the Luftwaffe Signals Corps, or the clerical detachments attached to field headquarters. Many entered willingly, driven by duty, fear, or the promise of steadier rations. Others were pushed by circumstance, by party officials, or by families convinced service would keep their daughters safer than the fire-scorched streets of Cologne, Berlin, or Hamburg. Uniforms were issued quickly. Training was brief. Expectations were simple: obedience, precision, and the appearance of unshakable confidence. But confidence collapsed faster than units could be mobilized. After the Allied breakout from Normandy in August 1944, German divisions reeled eastward in a broken stream of trucks, horses, bicycles, and on foot. The Falaise pocket had left gaping holes in the Weser, and by autumn the Siegfried Line, proudly advertised as an impenetrable wall, proved to be more symbolic than practical. Resistance was fierce in places, hopeless in others. In the confusion, auxiliary detachments of women were often swept along with retreating forces, their assignments shifting arbitrarily as headquarters dissolved overnight and command posts relocated in frantic bursts. By late October, thousands of these women found themselves closer to the front than intended. Anti-aircraft units operating near Aachen placed female auxiliaries in bunkers beside crews that dwindled weekly. Signals bunkers in the Eifel were staffed by teenagers barely trained to distinguish static from coded bursts. Clerks once responsible for paperwork now packed ammunition cases or carried messages by bicycle to units already half-shattered. The Allied advance surged relentlessly. American and British forces, buoyed by superior logistics, intelligence, and air cover, punched deeper into the Rhineland. When towns fell, Stahlberg, Eschweiler, Düren, the women attached to nearby German commands often had only minutes to abandon their posts. Some tried to follow retreating troops across fields torn apart by shellfire. Others hid in cellars until capture became inevitable. Many surrendered without firing a shot, stunned by the realization that the enemy closing in on them was not the monstrous figure conjured by years of propaganda but something more complicated, more human, and far more powerful. For the Allies, the rise in female POWs posed an unexpected logistical issue. Field manuals contained paragraphs on dealing with mixed civilian groups, but little about women in uniform, especially those attached to military branches rather than simple wartime labor. Commanders improvised. Temporary holding areas were created behind the forward lines, often within repurposed farmyards or fenced-off clearings. The priority remained the same: process, disarm, question, relocate. Cold wind swept through these improvised enclosures. Canvas tents sagged under frost. Guards kept their rifles slung but ready, uncertain what to expect from prisoners who looked less like combatants and more like displaced civilians wrapped in oversized greatcoats. Yet reports filtered through headquarters that these women often carried valuable information, communication codes, unit locations, or details about the collapsing German defensive network along the Rhine. The psychological climate inside Germany added another layer of urgency. Rumors spread among retreating troops that the Allies showed no mercy, especially toward female auxiliaries accused of aiding anti-aircraft units that targeted Allied bombers. Fear sharpened the tension during every surrender. Some auxiliaries trembled as they approached American lines. Others straightened their backs, refusing to let uncertainty betray them. Still, when the first Allied soldiers appeared, broad-shouldered, well-fed, confident, the shock rippled through the German ranks like an unexpected gust. Capture did not come as a sudden event but as a slow, grinding realization. The Reich was collapsing from west to east, and the women caught within its machinery understood they were stepping into the final phase of a war they could no longer influence. Behind them lay the ruins of command posts and burning towns. Ahead lay barbed wire, interrogation tables, and a world built by the victors. The atmosphere of this transitional moment, between surrender and the long journey into captivity, forms the foundation for understanding what happened next, and how both sides navigated a situation neither had fully prepared for. Once the women were disarmed and queued for registration, the machinery of Allied prisoner processing unfolded with the same steady rhythm applied to thousands before them. Trucks rumbled across muddy fields, their engines cutting through the winter haze as crates of supplies and rolls of fencing arrived to expand temporary enclosures. Snow melted into slush beneath boots. The ground smelled of soil, gasoline, and the faint metallic tang of spent shell casings buried just beneath the surface. The POW intake teams worked in shifts. Clerks hunched over wooden tables, their gloved fingers stiff as they copied names, birth dates, unit affiliations, and last known assignments onto forms speckled with droplets of icy rain. Medical corpsmen moved along the lines with stethoscopes hanging like cold pendulums against their chests, checking each woman for frostbite, infection, or the exhaustion that left some swaying on their feet. No one lingered longer than necessary. The front was still too close. Efficiency mattered more than comfort. Transport followed once the lists were complete. Groups were marched toward waiting trucks whose canvas flaps snapped in the wind. The ride to rear area camps took hours, sometimes a full day, along roads carved with ruts from endless convoys. American jeeps sped ahead, British dispatch riders passed on motorcycles that kicked up arcs of dirty snow, and ambulances carrying wounded men overtook the slow-moving POW columns with grim urgency. The women watched this traffic with a mixture of awe and dread. The scale of Allied movement, so organized, so abundant, was unlike anything they had seen on the German side for months. At the intermediate camps, the encounter between captors and captives deepened. Language barriers shaped every interaction. German auxiliaries asked cautious questions, some whispered, some bold, where they were going, whether their families would be informed, whether they would be kept separate from male prisoners. The guards answered what they could, sometimes with gestures or halting phrases. Uncertainty threaded through every conversation, yet there was an underlying order that reassured many of the women more than they cared to admit. Cultural differences revealed themselves in small details. The American mess tent smelled of coffee strong enough to cut through the cold, its aroma drifting across the compound like a foreign signal. The British sections operated with strict routines, roll calls at exact hours, equipment inspections that seemed almost ceremonial, and a reserved manner that contrasted sharply with the chatter of American MPs. To the German auxiliaries, who had lived under chronic shortages, every crate of rations and every well-fed guard represented more than military superiority, it hinted at a world entirely untouched by the hunger gnawing at German civilians. Processing included searches for documents or coded notebooks. Many of the women had carried signals logs or unit rosters in their coat pockets, unaware of their potential value. Intelligence officers examined these papers under lantern light, mapping the final disintegration of German command structures. Even the simplest detail, a frequency scribbled in the corner of a diary, a sketch of a bunker layout, could reveal vulnerabilities in the collapsing defensive line along the Rhine. Meanwhile, rumors moved through the ranks of prisoners like cold wind slipping through canvas seams. Some believed they would be transported overseas. Others insisted the Allies separated female auxiliaries according to their role in anti-aircraft operations. Many feared retaliation for having served units that targeted bomber crews. The truth was far less dramatic: the Allies were improvising. No army had expected to handle such numbers of women in uniform, and each camp commander adopted procedures that balanced security with decency, mindful of the political scrutiny that would follow any misstep. Nightfall added another layer of unease. The searchlights that swept the camp perimeters cast long, stretching shadows that made the women look older, wearier than they had hours earlier. Some huddled near the tent walls, whispering about home. Others lay awake, listening to distant artillery echo across the horizon like a memory of the world they had just left behind. By the time the first process groups were assigned to longer-term camps deeper inside Allied-controlled territory, a strange calm settled over them. The shock of capture had softened into a weary acceptance. They understood that the war, at least for them, was over, and whatever future awaited them would unfold behind barbed wire and under the constant gaze of guards whose size, confidence, and strange foreign ease had already rewritten their expectations. What came next would reveal the human, tactical, and moral dimensions of this encounter, perspectives shaped not only by war, but by the collision of two worlds neither had fully imagined. The first nights in the camps exposed the raw human distance between captors and captives more clearly than any military report. Frost clung to the tent ropes, and every exhaled breath turned into mist before fading into the dark. The women lay on thin mattresses arranged in rows, their bodies wrapped in greatcoats that still carried the smoke of burned-out command posts. Sleep came in short, restless fragments. Every sound, the clink of a canteen outside, the shuffle of a guard's boots, the whistle of a distant train, pulled their nerves taut again. Faces told the story more than words. Some women stared at the ceiling cloth, eyes hollow, replaying the final hours before surrender. Others hid their trembling hands under blankets when guards approached, refusing to show fear. A few tried to hold on to dignity through small rituals, braiding their hair before morning roll call, straightening their collars, keeping their boots neatly aligned. But beneath these surface gestures lay a deeper, unspoken reckoning. Many had joined auxiliary service believing they would remain far from danger. Now they confronted the truth that the Reich had swallowed them whole, dragging them directly into the war's collapsing edge. The Allied guards, towering in the doorway with their flashlights and clipped commands, represented not only defeat but a world that did not match the warnings they had been raised on. Strength radiated from those men, strength not born of brutality, but of abundance, confidence, and a rhythm of life untouched by the desperation consuming Germany. These quiet nights shaped the emotional landscape of captivity more powerfully than any interrogation could. They marked the beginning of a long internal unraveling, one that would deepen as new layers of interaction revealed the next angle. To the Allied officers overseeing the camps, the presence of so many female auxiliaries was far more than a humanitarian concern, it was an unexpected tactical advantage. For months, intelligence reports had noted the increasing reliance on women to operate radios, track aircraft movements, relay orders, and manage documentation across Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht field headquarters. Capturing these women meant capturing the connective tissue of German communication networks. In makeshift interrogation rooms, sometimes nothing more than barns cleared of hay or schoolhouses commandeered by advancing divisions, Allied intelligence teams questioned the new detainees with a mix of patience and precision. Maps lay spread across tables. Radios crackled with updated reports from the front. Photographs of bunkers, rail junctions, and anti-aircraft sites waited in neat stacks beside sharpened pencils. Interrogators understood that these women were not frontline fighters, but witnesses. They had seen the rhythm of messages sent and received. They knew which batteries had been redeployed, which command posts were abandoned, which units were starving for fuel. Many auxiliaries, exhausted beyond resistance, answered quietly. Others hesitated, torn between training and exhaustion. Yet even small details, changes in call signs, unusual patterns of encrypted traffic, shifts in supply convoys, held enormous value. As February approached, the Allies were preparing for the final push across the Rhine. Every piece of information helped refine predictions about how German forces would attempt to stall or mislead the assault. Thus the women, who had once sat behind radio tables or typed out orders in dimly lit rooms, now found themselves contributing involuntarily to the dismantling of the very system they had served. Their capture became a silent turning gear in the larger machinery of Allied momentum, a reminder that war was fought not only with tanks and artillery but with the flow of knowledge. This tactical significance flowed naturally into a third angle, one defined by the leadership required to maintain order during such an unusual influx of prisoners. The camp commanders, British, American, and occasionally Canadian, faced a challenge not covered in manuals. They were responsible for thousands of prisoners, but female auxiliaries demanded procedures that balanced discipline with restraint. Any rumor of misconduct could escalate to diplomatic scrutiny. Any lapse in control could endanger both guards and prisoners. Leadership here required a quiet firmness. Senior NCOs walked the perimeters before dawn, inspecting the wire for weak spots and checking that watch rotations remained consistent. Officers held briefings inside drafty wooden huts, instructing their men on handling searches, transfers, and interrogations with professionalism. Many guards were young and inexperienced. The sudden presence of women their own age in enemy uniforms demanded maturity far beyond what their training had prepared them for. Daily routines became acts of command. Orders were delivered in calm, measured tones to avoid panic. When tensions rose, usually over misunderstandings or rumors, the senior sergeant stepped into the cold with hands clasped behind their backs, speaking slowly, reasserting stability. Their leadership set the tone for the entire compound. If they remained composed, so did their men. For the prisoners, this discipline was disorienting. They had been taught to expect cruelty or chaos from the Allies. Instead, they encountered structure, guards who maintained distance, officers who enforced fairness, and a system run with a confidence that suggested the war's direction was no longer in doubt. This interplay of human emotion, tactical necessity, and leadership discipline formed the first layer of perspectives. Yet the story deepens further when the remaining angles reveal what each side believed about the other, and what the war had truly made of them. Years of propaganda had shaped the expectations German auxiliaries carried with them into captivity. Posters, radio broadcasts, and whispered stories portrayed Allied soldiers, especially Americans, as undisciplined brutes towering over their enemies, driven by greed and brutality. This image clung to the women like invisible debris as they approached the first camp gates. Yet reality undermined those fears almost immediately. When the American guards stood at attention during roll call, their posture conveyed strength, but not the savagery the women had been warned about. Their uniforms were sharply creased, not ragged or blood-stained. Their voices, loud and firm, carried no hatred. The British guards, reserved and methodical, treated each order as a ritual. The women watched these routines with a quiet astonishment. The predicted chaos simply did not exist. Likewise, Allied troops had their own misconceptions. For years, many believed German women in uniform were little more than fanatical puppets of the regime, unyielding, indoctrinated, or dangerous. But the exhausted figures sitting under the low canvas roofs contradicted that narrative. They were frightened, hungry, and worn down by the same winter that battered the front lines. Their boots were patched. Their gloves were mismatched. Some shook visibly during questioning. A mutual unmasking took place in those first days. The guards realized the prisoners were not zealots but mostly young clerks, radio operators, and typists swept along by a collapsing military bureaucracy. The women realized their captors were not monsters but soldiers performing a duty within an orderly system far different from the world they had known. This quiet dissolution of myth formed a foundation for the next angle, where the machinery behind their service came into sharper focus. Throughout the war, German female auxiliaries had played crucial roles in the technological arteries of the military. They operated switchboards linking field headquarters, tracked aircraft movements with grease pencils on illuminated plotting tables, and relayed coded messages through radio networks that stretched from coastal batteries to inland defense posts. Their presence in these positions reflected Germany's shrinking manpower and its increasing dependence on precision communications. Inside the Allied camps, the significance of this operational knowledge quickly became apparent. Intelligence teams brought in captured equipment, frequency charts, signal lamps, portable radios, and laid them out before the women, asking them to identify components. Even those who had handled only mundane tasks possessed fragments of information that, when combined with other sources, helped map the final German defensive zones. Some auxiliaries described the routine chaos inside Luftwaffe command posts during the last months of the war, flickering lights as generators failed, constant shifts in call signs as units dissolved, frantic attempts to preserve communication routes across the Rhine. Others spoke of anti-aircraft batteries where women logged incoming raids under the thunder of 88mm guns. Their words helped Allied forces trace communication patterns and anticipate where the remaining pockets of resistance might concentrate their efforts. The women realized, sometimes with sinking clarity, that their own technical efficiency now advanced the enemy's campaign. What had once been their strength, familiarity with radios, charts, codes, became a source of vulnerability. This operational intersection set the stage for a final angle, one shaped not by machinery or perception, but by the legal and moral boundaries surrounding these unexpected captives. The influx of female military prisoners placed Allied command within a delicate moral territory. International law recognized auxiliaries as legitimate members of the armed forces, yet mixed-gender POW populations posed risks and raised concerns that required strict oversight. Commanders could not rely on precedent. Few conflicts had produced such circumstances on this scale. Segregation became the guiding principle. Women were housed in separate tents or enclosed sections of the camp, always under watch but never exposed to situations that could create suspicion or compromise. Guards received explicit instructions: maintain distance, ensure safety, avoid unnecessary interaction. These rules were reinforced during nightly briefings, where officers emphasized that the treatment of these prisoners would reflect directly on the credibility of Allied authority. For the women, these measures created a paradoxical environment. They were prisoners living under constant observation, yet they experienced a form of protection they had not expected. The clarity of rules offered stability in a world otherwise defined by uncertainty. Even the inspections, cold, methodical, and sometimes humiliating, were carried out with a restraint that suggested discipline rather than dominance. As the women adjusted to these boundaries, they also sensed the moral weight carried by their captors. The Allies understood that any misstep could spread through the ranks of male prisoners or reach the ears of journalists traveling with rear area units. Thus both sides lived within a fragile balance of power and principle. With these angles drawn, the story now moves toward the moment where tension and circumstance converged, the turning point that revealed just how profoundly capture reshaped the lives of these women. The decisive moment unfolded under a sky the color of tarnished steel, the kind of late winter morning when sound carried unusually far. It was March 1945, and the roads leading toward the Rhine were choked with the remnants of a broken army, horse carts, abandoned guns, bicycles without tires, and soldiers trudging through mud that swallowed their boots to the ankle. Among the disorder moved a convoy of German female auxiliaries, escorted by a handful of harried officers who no longer believed in the orders they barked. They had been instructed to regroup near a village outside Remagen, where a temporary command post supposedly awaited. But as they approached the outskirts, they saw American tanks already positioned along the ridgeline, silhouettes broad and immovable against the pale horizon. The officers froze. The women stopped behind them, breath catching in the cold air. No one shouted. No one fired. It was simply too late for defiance. The first American patrol descended from the hill with weapons at the ready, boots sinking into the thawing soil. The German officers raised their hands. One attempted to speak but the words dissolved into the wind. A few auxiliaries clutched each other's sleeves. Others stared at the tanks, Shermans with engines purring like heavy animals, realizing that this was the end of every hope of slipping east, of finding another command post, of pretending the Reich still held shape. An American sergeant stepped forward, a tall man with a square jaw and a voice that cut through the morning like a blade. He ordered the Germans to form a line. The auxiliaries obeyed instantly, movements stiff with fear. A medic checked for injuries, an interpreter shouted instructions in accented German. Helmets glinted with moisture as the patrol spread out around the prisoners, securing the perimeter with casual efficiency. Then came the moment that would echo through the memories of the women long after the war ended. As the guards approached, drawing closer to escort the group down the slope toward the road, the auxiliaries saw them clearly for the first time, broad-shouldered men towering in thick winter gear, their faces flushed from the climb, their hands steady on their rifles. The contrast to the starved, exhausted German soldiers who had accompanied the auxiliaries along the retreat route was stark, almost unreal. A murmur rippled down the line. One woman whispered to another, her voice cracking with disbelief. Another stared openly, unable to hide her astonishment. The phrase spread like an accidental confession, "They're bigger than we expected." Not spoken with admiration, but with a dawning comprehension of what overwhelming strength looked like when it stood only a few feet away. The Americans noticed the whispers but did not react. They had seen this reaction before. Captured German soldiers, men and women alike, were often stunned by the physical presence of the Allied troops. Months of retreat, hunger, and relentless bombardment had hollowed out German ranks, while the Allies remained supplied, organized, and confident. The column began moving downward. Mud clung to their boots. Some auxiliaries stumbled, and the guards steadied them with quick, impersonal gestures. The women felt the difference immediately, the touch of men who held the power to command their fate, yet showed no malicious intent. It was a kind of strength they had not expected, quiet, controlled, and absolute. At the base of the slope, trucks waited with engines idling. As each prisoner climbed aboard, the gravity of the moment deepened. They were leaving the territory of a collapsing Reich and entering the custody of an enemy who had already breached the western door of Germany. The war they had supported with paperwork, signals, and clipped radio exchanges had arrived at its irreversible breaking point. The convoy rumbled away from the battlefield, past smoking craters and shattered houses, past soldiers who no longer saluted, past civilians who watched from cellar doors with the hollow eyes of people who had survived too much. Inside the trucks, the auxiliaries sat pressed together, listening to the steady hum of American engines overpowering the distant echoes of artillery. For the first time, many allowed themselves to think the forbidden thought: the Reich would not recover. Their surrender was not an isolated event but part of a vast and unstoppable collapse. Whatever loyalty they still held trembled beneath the weight of this realization. And as the trucks drove toward the processing areas behind the front, the true turning point awaited, where interrogation, order, and the full reality of captivity would force them to confront what their service had become. By the time the convoy reached the processing area, mid-morning had broken into a weak, gray light that filtered through frost-laden clouds. The camp was a sprawl of tents, low wooden huts, and fences topped with barbed wire, buzzing faintly with the distant traffic of trucks and jeeps. Guards moved with methodical purpose, guiding columns of prisoners into pre-assigned spaces while intelligence officers observed from raised platforms. The German auxiliaries, still stiff with shock, realized that surrender had only delivered them into a more structured, more controlled world, one where rules, rather than chaos, would define the next hours. The first step was identification. Clerks and interpreters worked with brisk efficiency, calling names, checking documents, and logging units. Each woman handed over any remaining papers or personal items, some reluctantly, some mechanically. Even those who had carried only pens or notebooks now understood that what they once held for operational purposes had become a liability. A diary note, a list of radio frequencies, a hand-drawn map, all were inspected with an intensity that made the women sit straighter, aware that the smallest detail could influence how they were treated or how intelligence reached Allied field commanders. Interrogation followed. Not violent, but meticulous. Officers asked questions about positions, communications, battery placements, and logistical movements. The auxiliaries answered with varying degrees of clarity, some guided by memory, others by instinct. They noticed, perhaps for the first time, the subtle control exercised by their captors. Every question, every gesture, every observation seemed designed not merely to gather information but to establish a psychological dominance, calm, measured, and undeniable. The psychological impact of this phase became almost tangible. For the women, the realization that surrender did not simply mean being behind enemy lines was profound. Their officers, who had once attempted to assert authority during retreats, now seemed ineffectual shadows compared to the organization and confidence of the Americans. Even the youngest auxiliaries began to sense the irreversible nature of their position. They were no longer participants in a collapsing defense, they were witnesses to it. At midday, the women were led to temporary accommodations within the camp. They passed male prisoners who watched silently, recognizing a shift in hierarchy. Female and male captives moved in separate corridors, under the watch of guards trained to maintain both security and propriety. This careful segregation underscored another dimension of the turning point. The Allies had not only won militarily, but they had redefined the terms of control. The auxiliaries were confronted with both physical containment and a demonstration of the rules governing it, reinforcing the idea that the world had changed irrevocably. Outside, the wind carried the faint echo of distant artillery. Snow and ice melted into mud, creating a sticky, unsteady path for both guards and prisoners. The women moved slowly, their boots heavy with residue from the road, their minds heavier with the weight of surrender. One of the older auxiliaries, whose uniform bore the faded insignia of a Luftwaffe signals unit, glanced at the line of American soldiers and noted with an involuntary clarity that this was no longer a war of propaganda or abstract fear. This was reality, the human, tactical, and moral reality of defeat imposed by an organized, confident force. The turning point crystallized further when small incidents began to unfold. A guard gently corrected a misaligned column, a medic calmly checked frostbite on a trembling hand, and a clerk patiently explained the processing forms in halting German. Each act, mundane on the surface, combined into a profound assertion of control and order. The women recognized, consciously or not, that the collapse of the Reich had delivered them not into chaos, but into the meticulous structure of an occupying force whose strength lay as much in discipline and morality as in weaponry. By late afternoon, the auxiliaries had been sorted, logged, and moved into designated living areas. Some huddled together in silent conversation, others stared blankly, wrestling with disbelief. The surrender, the march, the processing, the interrogation, all had converged into a moment where the finality of the war's outcome became unmistakable. No retreat remained. No command would return to rescue them. And the physical presence of the Allies, tall, steady, confident, had imprinted on their consciousness an image of power and inevitability they would never forget. As night approached, the camp settled into uneasy quiet. Fires crackled in the mess areas, faint smoke drifting into the cold air. The auxiliaries lay under thin blankets, the exhaustion of weeks of retreat and hours of processing finally pressing down on them. In their minds, the reality of surrender had fused with the scale of defeat, and the human, tactical, and moral dimensions of captivity had aligned into a turning point from which there was no return. The events of that day would echo in every subsequent interaction within the camp, through meals, interrogations, work details, and roll calls. For the German women, the surrender had become a defining memory, not only the moment they lost control of their immediate fate, but the moment they first understood the true scale of Allied power and the irreversible collapse of the world they had served. In the days following the surrender, the camp settled into a rhythm that masked the magnitude of the events that had delivered these women into captivity. Roll calls occurred with clockwork precision, tents were arranged in neat rows, and meals were distributed with measured consistency. Guards patrolled with disciplined steps, rifles slung but hands relaxed. For the German auxiliaries, this was a world both foreign and oddly reassuring. the predictable cadence of the camp was a stark contrast to the chaos of retreat, the crumbling towns, and the hurried movements that had defined the last months of the Reich. Medical checks continued in earnest. Frostbite and malnutrition were quietly documented, and those showing signs of severe fatigue were moved to heated huts. Some women had endured weeks of inadequate food, sleepless nights, and freezing temperatures. American medics, efficient and methodical, performed assessments with care that startled the auxiliaries, who had been conditioned to expect harsh treatment. A whispered word passed through the tents: this was not vengeance, not cruelty, it was order. Reports were filed daily. Intelligence officers catalogued not only names and units but operational knowledge the women might possess. Signals logs, messages, and observations from the field were compiled into binders that would inform Allied operations for weeks to come. Even small details, patterns in radio frequencies, locations of abandoned anti-aircraft guns, were added to maps that charted the collapse of German defenses. In this process, the women, once active participants in the Reich's military bureaucracy, had become involuntary contributors to its dismantling. Life inside the camp revealed other truths. The auxiliaries observed how the Americans coordinated logistics with calm authority. Trucks arrived precisely when expected, rations were distributed efficiently, and tents were maintained despite wind and snow. Guards demonstrated firm control without cruelty. Missteps, when they occurred, were met with instruction rather than punishment. These moments of unexpected civility unsettled the women, eroding deeply ingrained ideas about the enemy. The war had always been portrayed as a brutal clash between forces, but here, discipline and humaneness coexisted, reshaping perceptions. Letters and reports trickled through channels connecting the camp to broader Allied command. Field officers relayed numbers: how many prisoners had been processed, how many were women, and how many could provide actionable intelligence. Statistics turned into narrative: 1,000 auxiliaries, mostly in their late teens or early 20s, captured in the last week of February and early March, dozens of units identified, multiple operational weak points uncovered. Yet behind every statistic was a human story: shivering, tired, wary young women confronted by overwhelming power and unable to act on the knowledge they carried. Morale within the camp fluctuated in subtle ways. Some women tried to maintain routines reminiscent of their former military discipline, keeping uniforms neat, boots polished, and notebooks organized. Others curled into themselves, letting exhaustion and disbelief dominate. Conversations were sparse, whispers careful. Fear persisted, but it was tempered by the realization that the Americans were organized, methodical, and unlikely to act on cruelty. In these small, everyday patterns, the auxiliaries began to adjust to a new reality: captivity defined not by terror but by structure and order. Orders for relocation began to circulate. Groups were assigned to longer-term facilities deeper in Allied territory, often behind the Rhine. Trucks and buses were arranged, and guards briefed on logistics. Each move was orderly, efficient, and unhurried, a striking contrast to the frantic retreats that had marked the final weeks of German defenses. As the auxiliaries prepared to board transport, the enormity of what they had survived, and what they were leaving behind, began to settle into quiet, reflective consciousness. The Reich they had served was gone. The war, at least for them, was definitively over. The relocation to longer-term camps deep within Allied-controlled territory introduced the German auxiliaries to the broader scale of captivity. Railcars rattled along tracks lined with frost-bitten fields, carrying hundreds of prisoners at a time. The women pressed against each other in the dimly lit compartments, listening to the rhythmic clatter of wheels and the occasional murmur of guards pacing the aisles. Outside, remnants of a devastated landscape passed by: burned-out villages, twisted rail lines, and the skeletal remains of bridges, evidence of a war that had consumed everything in its path. Upon arrival at the camps, structures were larger and more permanent: barracks of wood and brick, kitchens capable of feeding hundreds, and infirmaries staffed with physicians and nurses. Security remained strict, but efficiency and routine dictated the pace of life. Roll calls, inspections, and work details became predictable markers in each day. For many of the auxiliaries, predictability offered a fragile comfort. They no longer faced the sudden panic of retreat or the threat of immediate capture. Instead, their world was governed by rules that, once understood, could be navigated. Interactions with guards and officers gradually revealed further nuances. While obedience remained mandatory, minor courtesies and respect were extended. Meals were adequate, hygiene facilities maintained, and medical attention available for injuries both old and new. Small acts, a blanket handed without comment, a warm cup of coffee, a steadying hand during roll call, etched an unexpected human dimension into the auxiliaries' perception of their captors. The contrast to the propagandized image of ruthless Americans grew ever starker. Intelligence operations continued quietly. Officers reviewed the captured women's knowledge of communications, logistics, and local unit movements. Patterns of anti-aircraft deployments, signals protocols, and last-minute retreats were catalogued and analyzed. Many auxiliaries found themselves recounting details involuntarily, their memories acting as a conduit for dismantling the very military network they had served. Some struggled with guilt, while others reconciled with the inevitability of defeat, understanding that the Reich's collapse was total. The broader psychological effect became apparent as days turned into weeks. Rumors of German defeats farther east, the fall of cities like Cologne and Aachen, and the encroachment of Allied forces across the Rhine filtered through camp channels. Each report reinforced the finality of surrender. Women who had once believed in the Reich's resilience now faced the quiet realization that their world had vanished, replaced by a system that ran on order, efficiency, and oversight. The numbers told a stark story. By March 1945, thousands of female auxiliaries were processed across camps in France, Belgium, and Western Germany. Mortality was low due to careful medical attention, but the psychological toll was immense. Letters from prisoners recorded exhaustion, disbelief, and growing resignation. Memoirs later described the eerie calm of life under barbed wire, the slow adaptation to rules, and the gradual reshaping of identity from soldier or clerk to prisoner. Many auxiliaries would recall the physical presence of the guards, their calm authority, and the overwhelming size and organization that had first impressed them upon capture. That moment, standing in the shadow of well-fed, confident soldiers, remained indelible, a defining image of the war's collapse. By late March, camps became semi-permanent hubs for processing, interrogation, and accommodation. Life settled into a rhythm of controlled monotony. The women learned to navigate the hierarchy, understand the expectations, and accept the limitations imposed upon them. Letters were occasionally allowed, medical care remained steady, and officers maintained firm but impartial oversight. In this environment, the auxiliaries had space to reflect, grieve, and internalize the scale of the defeat. The aftermath, in both human and operational terms, revealed the dual reality of war, the collapse of one system alongside the rise of another, not only in terms of territory or military might, but in the transformation of perception, authority, and daily life. The surrender had ended combat, but its consequences, the confrontation with organized, disciplined power, the unmasking of myths, and the slow absorption into captivity, would resonate long after the war's guns had fallen silent. The winter light had faded into early spring, yet inside the camps, a different kind of illumination persisted, one of awareness, resignation, and unexpected revelation. The German auxiliaries, once part of a sprawling military machine, now sat under the steady watch of their captors, surrounded by order, efficiency, and a humaneness they had never anticipated. They had surrendered not only their freedom but the very illusions of their world, and in that surrender, the war's broader truths crystallized. For many, the most striking lesson was the physical and psychological presence of the Allies. The soldiers they had feared, tall, confident, well-fed, had not wielded cruelty indiscriminately, but instead imposed control through calm authority. That presence became a mirror reflecting the collapse of the Reich, highlighting how exhaustion, disorder, and overstretched command had hollowed the German war effort. It was a power rooted not only in weapons and numbers, but in organization, reliability, and restraint, a stark contrast to the fearsome images propagated by years of wartime rhetoric. Beyond the human dimension lay the technological and tactical implications. The knowledge once held by these auxiliaries, the flow of messages, unit movements, logistical details, now informed the dismantling of the systems they had served. Their service had been repurposed without malice, a quiet testament to the way warfare hinges as much on information and coordination as on battlefield valor. In these interactions, the women glimpsed the unsettling truth that even mundane military tasks carried weight beyond immediate comprehension. Finally, there was the moral and historical resonance. The Allies' treatment of the prisoners underscored a principle rarely observed in war's chaos: authority and ethics could coexist. The auxiliaries experienced a disciplined restraint that transformed fear into cautious reflection, teaching that defeat did not have to mean degradation, and that humanity could persist amid devastation. In the long hours of the camp, the women considered what they had lost and what they had witnessed. The collapse of the Reich, the rise of an efficient, humane authority, and the surrender of control all merged into a profound understanding of history in motion. Their memories preserved the textures of fear, awe, and recognition, moments when reality outstripped propaganda and circumstance revealed unvarnished truth. The war had ended for them not with a bang, but with the quiet, inescapable realization of scale, order, and human complexity. In that realization lay the enduring lesson: power manifests not merely in force, but in presence, structure, and the measured exercise of responsibility, a truth as unsettling as it was instructive, shaping the lives of both captives and captors long after the last guns fell silent.